Hi, this is episode 6 of the Coordinate podcast. I'm your host, Soubhik. AI is making intelligence digital. Crypto is making institutions digital. Digital intelligence needs digital institutions. The mission of this show is simple: talk to the most fascinating entrepreneurs and intellectuals shaping this future and learn from them. Today, we are widening the lens of the show beyond distributed systems and starting a series on economics and market design, the rules that shape how markets actually behave. These ideas already run in your life: auctions, pricing, matching, and incentives, and they are about to matter more, even more, as software agents start transacting on our behalf. To discuss all this, today my guest is none other than Scott Kominers. Scott is the Seraphim Rock Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, a faculty affiliate of Harvard Department of Economics and the Harvard Center of Mathematical Sciences and Application, and a research partner at A16Z Crypto. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Really honored to be here and great to see both of you.
This episode has two parts. First, what market design is, how it differs from economics in the everyday sense, and where you are already encountering it. The second part is about agentic commerce, what it means, what's genuinely new, and what to watch out for. And to unpack this with Scott, I'm also joined by my co-host, Sreeram Kannan, founder and CEO of Eigencloud. Welcome, Sreeram.
My pleasure to be here, Soubhik. Our privilege to have you here, Scott. Excited to do this.
Thanks.
All right,
So
let's
excited.
get into it. So, Scott, the first question is, most people think markets are just about prices. Like goods have prices, each commodity has prices, but market design sounds like markets are being engineered. So, what is
Mhm.
market design in plain English? How is it different from that the traditional concept of economics that most layperson usually hear about it?
Great. Okay, so it's a fantastic question. And to start with, it's really in two parts, right? There's first, like, what are markets? And then there's what is market design? And so as you say, like, a lot of people think of markets as, places where there are prices. And, you think of, financial markets or the supermarket, like, sort of lots of places where, sort of prices exist. But what are prices? Prices really are a mechanism for enabling transactions. And to me and sort of to the field of economics, priced markets are one type of market, but really, like, what makes a market is the presence of agents who interact and seek to transact. So people seek to transact with each other. That might be like different individuals transacting or individuals transacting with businesses, subject to incentives. Right, the real defining characteristic of a market is incentives. Sort of the idea that people are going to respond to the rules and structures and opportunities of the situation, and try to usually we think of them as maximizing, trying to achieve some outcome that they want through transactions. So that encompasses all of the sort of usual priced markets we're used to thinking about, because that's one way that people like interact and transact. But also you've heard about like labor markets and marriage markets, right? These terms are actually real, right? They're not just sort of when we talk about the marriage market being a market, we're not just sort of saying that, right? Like it's not just sort of like an analogy, but really, like, there are a lot of incentives, right? People you know make all sorts of representations and invest lots of time and energy, and all of that is shaped similarly by market forces. Okay, so in that context, what's market design? So I like to take a very broad definition. I think of market design as sort of the field that uses economic theory and analysis to build practical solutions to real world problems, and especially real world what are called market failures. Places where a market does not manage to achieve its maximum social potential for whatever reason. And so you mentioned engineering, like, that's exactly the right way to think about it. Like, it's like the engineering aspect of economics. Sort of a lot of economics as a field is about trying to understand how markets work, what shapes behavior, which incentives dominate when, sort of like how it is that markets end up the way that they are. Market design sort of takes all of that as a basis and uses it to try and build solutions. So it's like, it's a bit like engineering. I also often think of it as a field of entrepreneurship. Even academic market design really is entrepreneurship.
So, in this case, why can't like simple prices be like just see the prices and the incentives just be
Yeah,
derived from there. So why is
great.
it not just sufficient?
So first of all, in lots of markets it is, right? So, um, it's funny, like I spent a couple of years at the University of Chicago, and I think of myself as a Chicago style market designer, which sounds like an oxymoron. But to me, for those who are sort of who don't have the background on the podcast, the University of Chicago is associated with many things, but one of them is the sort of classical economic sort of theory and framework called price theory. That's really about, sort of or that really sort of emphasizes the role of prices and more broadly, sort of like, sort of efficient markets in guiding socially optimal outcomes. And so like that sounds like it should be in conflict with the idea that markets need to be designed, right? Why, but actually,
Right, and that is the free market concept also. People say,
right.
why do you need to design? Like, it's just
Yeah,
free.
yeah. But okay, so a funny fact is that a free market is not actually a market without rules. Like even Hayek didn't think markets shouldn't have rules. Sorry, that's a sort of multiple negative. Hayek thought markets needed rules is the sort of proper composition of that sentence. Um, Rather, a free market is one in which market forces can work optimally, right? Sort of think of it as like a frictionless physics ideal, right? Like sort of the classical price theory model is one in which all the agents, like everyone participating in the market knows who all the other participants are. They all, sort of know how to communicate with and find each other. And that communication is frictionless. It doesn't take any time. But like we know that real markets mostly don't work that way, right? Like, labor markets have the problem that, when you're on the job market, you're looking for a job that wants you at that moment. And they can't sort of frictionlessly, like, sort of maybe the job you're looking for actually does want to hire you, but they don't have headcount at this moment. And by the time they get headcount, you've gone and worked somewhere else. Like those sorts of frictions are often not in the classical, sort of frictionless, sort of physics-like market models. And in fact, the University of Chicago was a core center of the discoveries that laid sort of the groundwork for what market frictions could be, right? For understanding when it is that markets do or do not actually achieve the physics ideal. And so to me, market design is, really about building the scaffolding and infrastructure in a market to enable it, the market forces to work, right? Sort of to enable the Chicago model to become true. Modulo, an important footnote that the other thing is the oversimplification people often make of the Chicago economic model is they assume it's just about maximizing efficiency, productivity, like sort of like, total output, which is really not, right? Like certainly like even Chicago will tell you that's not like what their model is, but people often like sort of just assume that. And so market design is not just about enabling market forces to work frictionlessly, but sort of like shaping the boundaries of the space they're in so that you achieve the maximum social potential.
So you've been mentioning this scaffolding and then
Yeah,
shaping the boundary. What does this actually look like? Like giving
great.
like with examples, like what is it materially
Yeah,
means
absolutely. So
for a
some
reader?
very simple examples, like, before you get to like the academic field of market design that's tried to sort of, often had to do very complicated designs to solve like large, very sticky public problems, like all of marketplace entrepreneurship is market design. And some of those designs are actually very, very simple, right? So if you think about, a platform like, Uber or, or Airbnb or, even like the previous incarnation, like, sort of search engines and sort of all of these platforms have the property that they're enabling a market that didn't previously exist. Right. So if you think about, let's stick with rideshare just because, or ride hailing, just because that's the first example I named. And it's one that probably every listener to the podcast is at least familiar with in some fashion. And many of them have probably used, this feels like it should be the simplest problem in the world at some level, right? Like from a raw economics perspective, what do we have? We have a bunch of people with cars that are not being used during the day. We have also a bunch of people who own cars and would like part-time work, right? They have a job that fills some amount of their time, but they'd like to be able to like do more work hours and earn more money doing it. And meanwhile, we have a bunch of individuals who are trying to get from point A to point B, and for whatever reason might need personal rapid transit, right? It might be that, they're in between meetings or they have to get to a doctor's appointment where they really care about being exactly on time, and the bus they can't guarantee. They don't own a car themselves. Again, think like in a sort of urban city center. or even just like they're in the middle of nowhere and like whatever route plan they had has disappeared. So from an economics perspective, this is straightforward. There's slack capacity, right? There's a bunch of seats in cars and people who would like to be driving those cars to pick other people up if they could earn money doing it. And there's people who want those rides. And so a very simple economic model would say, oh, this is easy. Just like, figure out how much the ride should cost, price them, and clear the market. Done. But of course, not only does it not work that easily, but you can build a huge business around the solution. And like, why is that? Well, because the market isn't quite as simple as the oversimplified model suggests, right? Like, it's not just there's like a quantity of empty seats in cars and a quantity of people who need cars, but rather those who need rides, those people are in locations and the cars are in locations. And like, even if what you want to say is, I want I want to use supply and demand. I want to set prices to clear the market. How do you know what prices to choose? Because like, how do you even know what the market is? Right? Like, first you have to have the technology infrastructure to get people into the room, right? Like I often say, like, the sort of classical economic model is, if only everyone were in the room together, maybe they could bargain their way to the efficient outcome. But like, how do you, like, market design has to be used to get them into the room. First, you need everyone on a platform, right? You need to thicken the market and give people a way to communicate with each other. That's what Uber and Lyft and all these ride-hailing apps do. And then there's actually some incredibly complex pricing logic, because you have to understand, like, what is the spatial structure of this market? How far are the cars from the people who want them? How do you even ensure that the cars are in the right places? You want to be forward looking and make sure that the cars are driving in the places where people are going to need rides 5 minutes from now, right? All of that actually requires a tremendous amount of infrastructure and data support. And like, so even just, if we had a ride hailing app, which was just, I could send text messages to individual drivers and ask them to pick me up, that's not going anywhere, pun not originally intended. Right? I'm like sitting here, I'm like texting my friend and they're like, hey, sorry, Scott, I'm in New York today. Like, can't pick you up in Cambridge. And, so you actually need a system that has the ability to process and understand who's where, what the future demand is going to look like at any given moment, and figure out both which drivers should go with which riders and what an appropriate price is in light of all of this information. And that's what a marketplace does.
Summarizing, so it seems like in the Uber case, there is this bootstrapping phase. You need to get people into the platform first. So that's a bootstrapping phase. Second, in the Uber case itself, there is a planning on forward looking. Like you are going somewhere, how to match all this. So these are the two like very distinct things that is probably not captured by the prices itself.
Yeah. Well, no, it is eventually captured by the prices, but it's not that it's not captured by the prices, but rather you need to solve all of that before you know what the right price is. And so,
okay.
So like, if you think about it, like Uber, like, does clear a market using prices, right? They use supply and demand. Surge pricing is like elevated pricing in times of high demand and low supply. Relatively high demand relative to supply. Really, it's not absolutely high demand or absolutely low supply. It's just that there's supply demand imbalance. But and so the classical model says, okay, just price it, go. But in fact, you actually need to do all of this marketplace action before you know what price should clear the market. And that's like, so even priced markets often need marketplace rules and or infrastructure to help determine market clearing.
What you said, the examples of this market, they are like very mature markets and there are standardizations that have happened. Someone is doing that standardization already and putting the price levels based on that, and everyone trusts that standardized body or whoever is doing that.
Yeah, so but it's not just about maturation, right? Like the ride-hailing market is pretty mature at this point, but the product is fundamentally individualized, right? So even if imagine ride-hailing were like a like a government service, right? This is part of the public transit network, which is one possible place it could end up, right? It's possible that like one day there'll be a bunch of sort of cars either, driven by humans or sort of driven by, by bots, or possibly some mixture of both, that are actually like part of an established, sort of public transit network. You'd still need to price the distance and the potential externality. An externality in economics is, I know you guys know, but again, for the audience, an externality in economics is when some transaction between two entities has impact on other parties who are not part of the transaction. So the externality, if I claim this, if I claim a Waymo, then somebody else who, my neighbor can't claim that same Waymo and might have to wait longer. That's an externality. So you can imagine that this market might mature to the point where like a lot of the pricing is sort of heavily sort of standardized in equilibrium, and to a large extent it's gotten there. Like it's it's close to like a mileage rate or something, but it will probably never become as standardized as taxis unless it gives up on supply and demand balance, right? Like, taxis have completely fixed rates that are based on some estimate of like sort of total transit demand in the city, but they're sort of always wrong on average, right? They're either too high or too low at a given moment. And that's why like when it's raining, it can often be really hard to find a taxi in some cities. Like, there's sort of like a big supply demand imbalance at that moment, and there's no way to expand supply, sort of on the margin, and you can't adjust price to balance.
So what you just said is that this standard, they don't collect information properly, like information at the edges properly. But on the other
Yep.
hand, these markets are dynamically collecting all the information in the real time and pricing based on that. Is that the right way to think all the inefficiencies of some of these markets?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. So let me try and make sure it has a couple, like the earlier question, it has a couple of different parts. So there's the market is collecting the information, and the market is processing the information into sort of like into what's actually like happening in the transactions. And those are slightly different things again, right? So we often talk about markets as information aggregators, right? Sort of like, you talk about like price signals. In fact, a lot of people sort of mistakenly, in my view, think that like the point of a market is to determine the price signal. Like to me, that's actually like an intermediate step, right? The point of the market is to solve a resource allocation problem. And often it does that by creating a price that enables the allocation problem to be solved, balances supply and demand. And then reading off that price tells us about supply and demand, right? When the price is really high, it means that like demand is high relative to supply. And so the signal is about demand and supply is actually sort of a secondary consequence of the market solving the allocation problem. But we can think of like, that as integrating information, right? Like when if your rideshare ride is like relatively cheap, it means, that there are a lot of drivers out relative to expected demand for the next immediate moment, right? So that tells us something about the market, sort of having aggregated its estimate of the future, future demand. Sometimes, like in the pricing of rideshare, or ride hailing, sometimes the sort of this like market infrastructure layer is doing that information aggregation, right? It's not like the market, in part, the reason you can't figure out what to price it yourself. In fact, Sidecar had this. One of the competitors to Uber and Lyft early on, which I think actually, if I remember correctly, originated this idea of riding in an individual's car rather than like a livery car or something like that. They basically thought that the right way to do this was to have, bidding and like sort of like pricing in the market, right? Like different drivers would like look and see, sort of how far they had to drive to get to you and submit prices. And then you would choose one in an auction mechanism. And like at some level, like, that kind of sounds good, right? Like drivers know how annoying it is to drive across the, sort of some distance. Like, but actually like no driver nor any rider have enough information about the total market to know what a good price is. Like, I can see maybe the prices in front of me, but like, I don't know if I wait an hour, like, is that can I get a much better price? Like, is it, you need a lot of information. And so what modern ride hailing companies do is they integrate all of this information into the computed price. And they do that via, sort of route planning algorithms and demand estimates and sort of all this like, sort of pre-computation. And then the fact that the prices clear the market means that they have successfully aggregated that information, right? Like when the prices get really out of balance, that means that like something went wrong in the aggregation system. Lots of markets, we think of the market clearing as happening, sort of, you think about like a limit order book financial market, right? We think of market clearing as happening because by lots of agents coming in and submitting their orders. And then the market just sort of clears as many orders as it can, and that like settles on a market price. And so there, the market itself, just this like simple buying and selling process is actually doing the information aggregation, right? The price signal, same thing. The price at the end, assuming it clears the market, is a good statistic for, what the market demand supply balance or imbalance is. But it did that entirely through individual market behavior rather than through this complex pre-computation step. And that has to do with the amount of like commodification of the goods and the ease of executing the transaction, right? Like it's hard in the case of ride hailing because the market participants, right, don't know what price they actually want. Right, like you might know what your reservation rate is. I'm not willing to drive, that for more than $10, but I don't know whether I should be charging $10 or $50. Whereas in the case of like a classical, like sort of two-sided exchange market, participants do know their prices and, their own individual, like, preferred prices. And, often execute many transactions. And because of that, they're able to be informed enough for the market to pick up their information. Sorry, I know I've been like harping on that side. Let me quickly go back to the other side, which is, how does the information get in there at all? Right? Like that's sort of, we just talked about the process by which market clearing aggregates information, in particular in the context of price signals. But there's a different issue, which is sometimes the information just isn't in the market, right? So like, for example, we'd like to believe that the price of a publicly traded company is a really good reflection of, again, this is all massively oversimplified, right? There's tons of things that determine equities prices. And so we're doing an abstraction. We'd like to imagine that the price of a publicly traded company is like some estimate on average of people's like estimate of its value and future progress and revenue flows and sort of all the things that are attached to the company.
So this is the topic of the opt-in and opting out of the market. This goes back into that.
Exactly. So like, lots of times people opt out either intentionally or just through unawareness. And markets are only as good, right? Even like the best market clearing mechanism in the world, will only get you as far as the participants in your market can get you. And by the way, actually, and from a market design perspective, that often creates interesting opportunities. So for example, Airbnb, especially when it started out, they were doing a lot of rooms in people's houses or like rent someone's like house when they're out of town, right? Now like a lot of Airbnb is professionalized into people who are basically running like, sort of full-time, hosting, sort of like, they have a building or they have, sort of like a carriage house or something, right? Like there's a lot of like professionally managed Airbnbs that are being managed as Airbnbs now. But like when the platform started, it was much more people like hosting in their houses, while they were there. So like, have an extra bedroom or extra floor in the house or something, or, houses, apartments, whatever, or, using houses, sort of renting out their houses when they were out of town or something like this. A category of really high value houses that would be great to rent out are fancy vacation homes. And you will be unsurprised to learn that there were a lot of fancy vacation homes that were sitting unused for like most of the months of the year that were not listed on Airbnb. And you're like, now, wait a minute, here, hang on. Like, again, the simple economic model says this should be really simple. We got a bunch of people with really nice houses. We've got some people who'd like to stay in those nice houses. Like, there must be some price at which they can get, they can solve this matching. And moreover, you even know where these houses are, right? Like, you want to go hang out in Aspen. Like, there are some people with vacation homes in Aspen. Why can't you just like, sort of, have a platform where you pay to stay in their houses? And of course, like you're both smiling, right? Like there's something not quite right about that story. And of course, the people who have extra second, third, seventh vacation homes or whatever, first of all, often are relatively price inelastic, right? You can tell them like, hey, Airbnb, like a typical Airbnb rental is like, $300 a night, $1,000 a night, maybe at the really high end for like renting a house. You tell them like, hey, we can get you an extra like $5,000, sort of, a month, like renting out your house on Airbnb, for 5 nights a month. A natural response might be like, okay, sort of, I appreciate the offer, but if somebody knocks over that art piece that's worth like, $100K, I'm already in the red on all of this. And so Airbnb is not a good mechanism for renting out really fancy, well-kept vacation homes. On the one hand, Airbnb has become this massive mass market, like sort of, marketplace that has really transformed the way people use, sort of short-term and even medium-term, especially since 2020, rental housing. On the other hand, there's this part of the market that Airbnb could not reach and really still mostly hasn't reached, that this other platform was able to optimize around, but it's a really different business, right? Like, if you're going to have concierges in the cities, like, taking care of the houses, suddenly this is like a logistics business. You're basically like a decentralized hotel chain in a way that Airbnb is not quite, right? They don't have to maintain, these, they don't have to maintain cleaning services or whatever. People can provide those services, but as third parties. And so, market design is about choosing the sources of market failure you want to go after and the part of the market you want to go after, and designing a marketplace solution that fits those challenges, right? A lot of people sort of mistakenly think that the idea is you just like fix every possible cause of market failure at once. If you're really lucky, you might be able to do that by the end of the day. But at the start, like really you should pick sort of a couple that you have special expertise in addressing. And you can have very different marketplaces in the same market solving versions of the same problem, right? Airbnb and One Fine Stay are both solving, in effect, slack capacity rental housing for travelers, right? Like that's the same market, which by the way is also what hotels are solving, right? Like there's sort of like multiple evolved solutions in the same market category, but like targeting different parts of the market with very different market designs.
That's a really cool explanation. I had a question on what are the goals or objectives that you consider when designing markets, right? You
Yeah,
could
great.
design like for social optimality, you could design for some kind of balance of powers, you could
Yeah.
design for, the market maker's optimality, in which case, it's Uber's take rate, long-term value, whatever.
Yeah.
So is there a taxonomy of how you think about possible objectives for market design?
It's a great question. I mean, so there's both. So first of all, I mean, there are objectives and there are constraints, right? So for example, one constraint, which people sometimes forget about, is that in order for a marketplace to succeed long term, it actually has to be, sort of sustainable. It has to be both from a financial perspective and from an operational and infrastructure perspective, and from the perspective of however it affects the market. So, for example, actually, food delivery is a good context for this. So, like these food delivery platforms, have the property that, first of all, there was for a long time question about whether they would be sustainable at all, right? Sort of like a lot of the, sort of, especially when they were all competing very heavily for market share, maybe about like 8-ish years ago, there was this massive amount of couponing, right? Like, sort of any of the San Francisco people listening to this will remember, like, sort of getting like dozens and dozens of like Uber Eats coupons, and then you get, and then in response, right? Not really in response, right? It's just like, you just happen to also get DoorDash coupons at the same time, like, sort of, and like there's this tremendous competition for market share among consumers. But it involved like, at least to some degree, like selling, sort of selling the goods at a very low cost, right? Like probably for at least some restaurants below average cost, right? Like, some restaurants were probably like, losing money, or the platform was losing money, or both on some of these sales as they sought to acquire consumers. That's not a long run sustainable market. They were all competing strongly for market share, offering lots and lots of coupons. They were all trying to compete for consumer market share. And the way to do that was to, or so they perceived, was to offer lower and lower prices, free delivery, sort of 50% off discount, whatever. But it's a problem, which is that restaurants are a really low margin business, right? Like it's sort of very, very difficult to make money as a restaurant to begin with. And then, moreover, like delivery is actually like not cheap to execute either, right? And like, so they were sort of raising the cost operationally, right? You've gone from, the restaurant producing the food and like, serving it in the restaurant or handing it to a person sort of to take out, to, now you hand it to someone who's delivering it. They have to find you. They deliver the thing. So we've added an extra stage of labor in the middle. When restaurants themselves were managing delivery, this was actually like pretty expensive. So doing it now with what's called double marginalization, because in this case, triple marginalization, because there's like multiple parties like taking their margin in the middle, puts even more pressure on the restaurant margins. And then you're going to go and discount it. And like, wait a minute, hang on here. Like at some point, this is not going to become financially sustainable. It's actually going to be very expensive, and they're intentionally discounting to try and capture consumers. And worse, they're maybe training a consumer behavior. There's a lot of concern for a while that they trained consumers to only purchase when there were coupons. And so then, like, you've like not only done this unsustainable thing to try and grab market share, but you've actually, put yourself at risk of making your business completely irrecoverable because you've trained your users to only do a thing, to only buy when there's this unsustainable pricing. And it took a long time to unwind that. What these delivery companies should have done, and they eventually really seem to have mostly switched to, is treat the suppliers as partners and try and change the market equilibrium so that delivery is a big part of consumption and a big part of those suppliers' businesses, right? So back when, food delivery was a negative net value proposition for the restaurants all the time, or most of the time, they would do everything they could to get you off the platform. Like I remember receiving food deliveries with a we deliver directly, like call us next time and you'll get 15% off, which isn't competitive with Uber Eats giving you 50% off, right? Like it actually, but it was much, much better for the restaurant. In fact, even if the restaurant had been giving you some, they were probably being subsidized to some degree by Uber Eats, but probably not, whatever that individual like gap was, like 35% or something. It was probably much better for them to order from them directly. And indeed, I mean, today you still see differential pricing between like Toast and other point of sale based ordering systems and the delivery platforms like Uber Eats and DoorDash and so forth. But they've moved now mostly into a much more sustainable market posture, which recognizes first that the customers actually like this is a pretty like, it's a luxury good. It's not like luxury in the sense of like Chanel, but it's luxury in the sense of this is a, sort of a service that, is being bought by people with, with reasonably large, sort of, budget shares to allocate to it. And so it turns out that like consumers are pretty inelastic, or the people who buy delivery food from delivery platforms like are pretty inelastic on price. And so actually like the restaurants have raised their effective prices, right? You're often seeing, and Instacart, like this is very explicit. Like when you go on Instacart, it will tell you like at most grocery stores, at least most grocery stores around here, I don't know exactly what the distribution across the country is, but in the Boston area, Instacart will tell you like prices are higher than in store. Right there, it's even like very explicit. Like the prices are higher, covering a lot of those sort of additional costs that go into the process because it's recognized that many of the purchasers, for whatever reason, are more price inelastic. Either they, have a, higher budget share or more need to have the thing delivered. Baseline, in order to have a successful market design intervention, whatever you're doing has to be sustainable. It has to be the case that people don't want to sort of undo your intervention. And, that goes for marketplace businesses. It goes for, incidentally, we haven't talked much about matching theory, but a lot of my dissertation work and a lot of my research is in this field that, among other things, was responsible for the redesign of the medical residency match in the United States and many other places. And one of the sort of first interesting facts of matching theory, like you learned it on the first day of a graduate market design class, is that there's this thing called stable matching. Matching is stable if, both no one is matched to a partner they find unacceptable and no pair mutually prefer each other to their assigned match partners. And it turns out that like a bunch of different medical residency systems, mostly in the UK, but sort of in various places around the world, used matching mechanisms to decide which doctors should go to which residencies. And Some of them chose mechanisms that happen to have this stability property, right? And what does the stability property mean in practice? It means if you get on the phone, you have your third choice residency, and you called your top and second choice, they'll both say, no, sorry, we have doctors we prefer to you, and vice versa, right? So there's no incentive for anyone to get on the phone and try to renegotiate. One of the earliest findings in matching theory, in a paper in, I think, Science by my Al Roth, who was my dissertation committee chair, actually, is that the places that chose stable mechanisms, the mechanisms were sort of sustained themselves, right? The people, like, they kept running over time. And the places that chose unstable mechanisms, those matching processes mostly collapsed. And so, sustainability can mean many things, right? But it basically means, is the outcome good enough for market participants that they want to keep participating? And in the context of a business, it means also, one of those participants is the business, right? Is the outcome good enough for them that they can afford to go forward and keep running the marketplace?
So I want to interject here quickly,
go.
and just to recap, on this question, that in the food delivery example, there was in the bootstrapping phase with the tokens and all this thing, there was a perverse incentive, and
Yes.
the businesses were getting hit mostly, and the platform was getting hit. But it was not sustainable, and the consumers were just ripping it off. And and they changed the dynamics where the businesses internalized the cost. They made the prices higher, and the benefit they got, the main benefit, the reason they were able to do it, because it became classified as a little bit of a luxury good, while consumers are not price sensitive as much as you would have expected in the beginning. So they were still open to buying this good at a little bit of higher price. So that helped in the food delivery service. In the residency thing, in the example that you are giving, is that the stable matching, right? You mentioned the word stable matching. So you want to match the doctors with the hospitals in a way that you use the word mutually, which is super important, that both of them should not, like I might prefer, oh, I should have gotten into this hospital, like a higher hospital, like of course it's my benefit, I want to go into top hospital, but the hospital should also find me to be a top candidate for, they should not find some other so mutually they are not able to find stable matching. And
yes, they can't find what's called a block. So there's no one who can recontract profitably after the fact. The matching is assigned; it's stable. When the matching is stable, what it means is that no pairs can sort of jointly deviate to renegotiate and thus cause potential further reallocation and reassignment.
I see. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
You are continuing the
Great. Yeah. So
explanation.
objectives. So first, there's sort of like a baseline objective of sustainability and like sort of like operationally, like financially, like the marketplace has to be able to run. And then there's sort of and I sort of think of that as like a lower bound constraint, maybe. And then
so
there's like
can we encapsulate that from like the price side? That would be the double handshake moment, right? Like of saying, okay, this is actually a win-win for me.
Yes.
And that is basically extending that to whatever the time horizon and the kinds of participants and the kinds of preferences that they actually bring. Is that the right way to think about that first constraint?
That's a great way to think of it, actually. So that's right. So not all markets that create value share that value in a way that enables sustainable marketplaces, right? Like it's possible that you could have it's possible you have a market where like sort of one person captures everything. And so like the market actually collapses, not because that person's not getting enough value that they could share it, but they have no incentive to do or structure with which to do so. And indeed, so getting to sort of mutual benefit is an important sort of threshold for sustainability. And then on the other hand, there's like sort of like how do we maximize the value that's created? So there's you earlier in the podcast, if someone pauses right here and rewinds about 40 minutes, they'll hear me saying things like maximizing total social potential of a market, which is a really funny way to say it, right? Like a lot of people say like, I want to maximize like, sort of transactions, or I want to maximize like the value, like, but total social potential is like, sort of like a higher order objective function than just total productivity or something like that. Although in some markets, total productivity basically is the thing that we're trying to maximize. But social potential like is sort of a combination of the efficiency of the market. What economic efficiency is sort of how well it solved the allocation problem. Like, did it sort of like create as much value as the market possibly can, but mixed also often with things about fairness and equity and distribution, right? Like you might care not just that your market produces lots and lots of goods, but actually like you also care about how the sort of the wealth from that production is distributed, or you care about ensuring participation, sort of even among people who might not naturally show up at your market. This is why lots of marketplaces go and like try to bring in new participants, right? Like that often comes from an objective of equity or of value sharing or something of the sort, rather than just sort of like the simple like let's maximize like what this market produces today. Mm, And then there are sort of like you can think of them as like sort of I don't know, like they're sort of objectives for market function, right? So there's sort of this high order objective, like you want to maximize the social potential and like sort of what your market achieves as some mixture of like what it produces, who shares the benefits of that production, sort of what the long run value is, right? Sort of um, I tell my students it's like you're seeking to create a sustainable source of value, like a novel, sustainable source of value. And so novel, we're like creating new value. Value, it's real, like it's socially valuable. Sustainable incorporates a lot of these different objectives we talked about, and also somewhere in the midst of that are these distributional questions. But then there are also questions about how, you might as a designer specifically. And again, when I advise people on their marketplace designs, I spend a lot of time also thinking about sort of the micro details of market function. So, for example, um, lots of times when you run an auction, right? If you run a procurement, if the government runs a procurement auction, maybe they want to ensure that that not all of the information about the bidders is leaked.
So you mentioned one thing here is this privacy, the transparency, how much preference they are revealing, and the market generally takes care of. But so does that mean there is some kind of trade-off between how much in private information each user is revealing and how much optimal goal that is being reached here?
Sometimes, yeah,
And you mentioned bidding. So bidding is only one type of revealing the preference, but you can have like a multi-dimensional vector there
absolutely,
of what your preference is, which might not be captured in the bidding price, right? So now, what is the
absolutely.
privacy there in that case?
Great. Okay, so lots of different pieces to that. So first of all, you know, the how much information is revealed, how much information is taken in by the market goes to this thing we talked about earlier with like how much information is in the market or in the marketplace to aggregate. And interestingly, it can go in both directions, right? So you might say, oh, well, if I like, hide what bidders bid, then that's clearly worse, right? We're going to do a much worse job at aggregating information. But actually, not obvious, right? So dark pools and other sorts of like sort of like silent transaction or silent in the sense of like they don't generate a public signal of the price, sort of or of the transaction terms. Silent transactions sometimes bring in participants who wouldn't show up otherwise, right? Why do dark pools exist in financial markets? It's because some participants want to do large enough orders or otherwise sort of like noticeable enough transactions that if they did them in sort of like the ordinary exchanges, that would reveal information they're uncomfortable revealing. And so in order to get them to participate at all, you have to give them a mechanism to not reveal that information. Similarly, here's a wacky example, wacky, very important example. Uh, I worked with a team of economists that advised COVAX, which was this sort of cross-country vaccine collaboration, starting in 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the questions that they faced was that vaccine ingredients are very scarce, right? Sort of like prior to 2020, the world had never produced vaccines in the order of magnitude of what was needed in 2020/2021, right? Sort of like the total vaccine production capacity in the world across all vaccines was too low to like do what we wanted to do just for COVID-19. And so a lot of key ingredients were really scarce and like did not have a supply chain at the scale that was needed. And worse, like a lot of those ingredients in one fashion or another were, booked by, individual companies 18 months before they knew whether their vaccine would actually make it through trials. And so, and you might discover you made it through trials, but actually you need slightly more or slightly less of an ingredient than you thought. And so slack capacity again, right? Like sort of economics said this should be easy. This is going to be our slogan for the day, right? Like slack capacity is easy, right? There's excess supply. You should just sell it to people who have excess demand. There's excess supply and excess demand in the vaccine market. But a lot of these companies were publicly traded. And there's a lot of uncertainty about like the demand for the vaccine, demand for the ingredients. And also they just, a lot of the sort of trial stage information or production information, for whatever reason, they didn't want to leak because it was, private, sort of private IP at different stages. And so there was a challenge, like, how do you manage, a way of clearing the market for these very scarce vaccine ingredients that some people have excess of and some people have excess demand for without, causing, like, without leaking to the sort of market information about an intermediate stage of a trial that might not yet be conclusive in either direction. Because you gotta get your supply chain in place before you know what some of the outcomes are going to be. And so COVAX, really led by CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiatives, set up what is basically a dark pool in vaccine ingredients. Right, a way for companies to use them as a trusted broker to say, look, we have this much extra LAL, like, does anybody need it? And sort of like manage exchange of these very, very scarce resources in a fashion that, passed through basically like a silent broker without producing public market information. And so again, these are transactions that otherwise probably would never have been able to happen. But here, like they literally saved lives. Like there was this because it raised the total number of doses that could be produced in total, sort of in at scale, in that period of extreme scarcity. And so again, like market participants' preferences, but then also sometimes revealing lots of information can be good for price discovery, right? Like it's sort of, how does the information from dark pools percolates back into the market, because eventually, like, sort of a lot of those transactions, sort of pass also through market makers, right? That percolate their signals back. But in like, an art auction or an art sale, right? Like a brokered sale is often a lot less transparent than a public auction at Christie's or Sotheby's. And so, when a brokered sale happens, you might never learn what the price was. And so if you think that like that price, the public might never learn, right? Like, it might be the broker and the artist and the buyer, or the previous owner and the buyer, like, alone. Whereas, sort of, if you bid on a piece at a public auction, you can see not just, sort of what all the other pieces in that auction sold for up to that point, but also like who else is bidding often, like, or some amount of like how much bidding is happening, what their bids are. And that might actually cause you, a very, very famous result from 1980s auction theory called the linkage principle, that might cause you to feel that you can bid more confidently because you're absorbing information about other people's estimates of the value through the bidding process. That would never happen if the bidding was completely silent and like in a sealed bid process. Market participants' preferences and the relation between those preferences and information and the information revelation of the market clearing process affect how much information the market aggregates, but it's very like non-monotone and like depends a lot on the details of the market.
Got it. So this is so it depends on the context. Each context, each market
Exactly.
have their own thing. Got it.
And that's another thing, by the way, that makes this like engineering, right? When you're designing a marketplace, you have to think really hard about the details. And again, there's another thing I like, Al Roth says, sort of as a market designer, details matter. We often find ourselves building really, really detailed, like, sort of engineering schematic level sort of understandings of a market in a way that like lots of theory doesn't, but it's like very akin. Is this the first mention of crypto and we're like just at the 1 hour mark? That's very much akin to the way a lot of crypto businesses are built, right? There's this fundamental intellectual and incentive question at the core. And that relies on a really, really concrete understanding of how, like, what the market is trying to achieve, how market participants behave, and what the sort of what their incentives are, right? What they're individually optimizing, and how that aggregates up into market behavior. And then how do you place the sort of the guardrails and structure to enable the market to achieve its full potential?
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you mentioned this, like optimizing for total social potential.
Yeah.
And one of the things that triggered is this question of uh, markets as evolutionary versus markets as intelligent design, right? And I think a
Yeah.
lot of the market design field is about like bringing some thoughtfulness and like
Yep.
into the design a priori. And it does seem like as we are learning about this field here ourselves, but also like our audience here, uh, the scale of transformation that can be brought with intelligent
Absolutely.
market design does seem like a massive addressable market. I just want to speak to like a few points that you brought in here and would love to hear your comments on them. Right. So you mentioned participant recruitment as a kind of core
Yeah.
problem in market
Absolutely.
design, and the internet as a kind of like a technology that accelerates, revolutionizes like the ability to go recruit
Yep.
participants. You mentioned verifiability and transparency of the market mechanisms,
Absolutely.
crypto and, cryptography, verifiable execution, private execution, censorship resistance,
Absolutely.
all these technologies as like, core components in solving that problem. You mentioned like sustainability, part of it is like who owns the network effects that accrue. Is it a
Yes.
single intermediary that owns it? Is it the network in some sense owns and governs these network effects? Crypto and blockchain technologies are speaking to mechanisms that actually enable networks to own these network effects. And finally, you
Yep.
mentioned strategic complexity, right? AI
Yes.
and agents as new mechanisms that can massively absorb, be a buffer for taking in
We hope.
preferences.
Yes.
And reducing this, so it does seem like there is an explosive like combination of these things just in the air, that
Oh yeah.
if you bring in the internet, you bring in these like crypto and verifiability technologies, you bring in the idea that networks can own the network effects, you bring in the idea that agents can help reduce strategic complexity. It seems like markets are poised for a
Yes.
massive transformation globally. So I want you to speak to this
I,
idea of this addressable market of market design itself.
yeah. Look, is what I'm biased, right? Like but it's revealed preference, right? Like a huge part of the reason that I do work in this field and have especially chosen to focus on crypto architectures as infrastructure backbones for marketplaces, um, is because I agree, right? I think that the technology for you know for shifting a lot of existing market challenges come from the need for orchestration in one fashion or another, and or from incentive misalignment between internet marketplaces. Often there's some degree of incentive misalignment between the platform and its users, and both of these are things that I think crypto is poised and has not just poised to solve, is actively solving. And then to your point on strategic complexity, and this I've actually, it's funny, this one I've been thinking a lot recently. And when we've talked some, the I've been thinking a lot about agentic marketplaces. Like, what happens if agents become sort of the main means by which people access lots of markets? And first of all, it's fascinating. Second of all, the potential is extraordinary, right? Like, if you think about a lot of a lot of the challenges, like when I in complex bespoke pricing, in bidding in auctions, like a lot of the things that like marketplace designers have had to contend with for the last 15 years. Um, if only you had a really, really fast algorithmic, sort of negotiator or like bidding agent that could go and bid for you, like, it would be so much easier. We already know lots of classes of mechanisms that we've had to sort of like go away from because we didn't have a way to manage the sort of the strategic or the strategic structure or the expression of your preferences because they're too combinatorial. Lots of things like that, like agents promise, or at least we expect them to unlock. Um, about 10 years ago, I was asked, like, what is the new contract theory for blockchains? And I sort of said, what do you mean the new contract theory for blockchains? and someone said, well, I don't know if you know, but like, blockchains let you like, make these like sort of durable commitments and like, and like, yeah, but that was like contract theory before we had modern contract theory, right? First, theorists studied the case of complete contracts with like perfect enforcement and then realized that like that wasn't reality. And so they had to like, build all these workarounds, and we got the theory of incomplete contracts and imperfect enforcement and like, imperfect observability. Like, blockchains have actually let us use a lot of these sort of, in many ways, like better, easier, more complete solutions from early economic design. And I think that agent sort of markets are going to do the same, that basically there's a lot of stuff we know, or we know we could do if only we could take away the fact that the operation had to be done by a human and still do it in a trusted and complete way. And again, I mean, you even see like there are companies that sell bidding agents, right? That's literally what they're called. This is not a new product category. This precedes generative AI by like 10, 12 years, right? There are people who have like
Ad
sold.
options.
Yeah, exactly. Like ad auctions. Perfect. Exactly right. Right. Like, probably 100% of our listeners like know about ad auctions, but like, again, quick context note. The vast majority of ads on the internet are sold via auction, and like there are these very fast, like individualized auctions per query or per landing on page or whatever. And of course, there isn't like a human sitting there like pressing a bid button for each one. First of all, they couldn't do it quickly enough. Second of all, like just way too many queries. And third of all, it's just not a good use of human time. So like for this incredibly high frequency, high value market, there have been lots and lots of bidding agent innovations long before there was, generative AI type agents. And we know that unlocked a lot of new technology opportunities for both using ads more broadly, for sort of expanding the ways in which ad marketplaces could be cleared and like the types of products you could sell. For better or for worse, right? Like, sort of some people think we maybe have too many ads now, but like it's unambiguous that this has paid for a lot of the first and second wave of the internet, right? Like it's sort of whether we like all of its consequences or not, like this is the thing that allowed, social media platforms to come to exist and become sustainable.
And it also paid for the creator rewards.
Yes, that too. Right. Sorry. Okay, good. That's what I should be advertising. Ha. Paid for creator rewards. But like, imagine that for everything, right? If only you had the efficiency, like we talked at the beginning very early about transaction costs. Many people have heard of the cost theorem, which is this idea that if there are no transaction costs, then like the market will find its way to the efficient outcome. Corollary, if there are no transaction costs, then the initial allocation of property rights doesn't matter. So, so long as there are no externalities. So what the cost theorem is really a negative result, right? The result is absent transaction costs, the market will just sort of like get to the efficient allocation somehow, right? But actually what it really highlights is that there are transaction costs everywhere. There are bargaining frictions, there are communication frictions. You might have to like talk with lots of people and like get them all to agree at once. If you think about markets that have a lot of frictions in them right now, with many, we hope that adding agents can, in a sort of decentralized way, do what centralized marketplaces did in Web 2 to increase competition, right? Like, we had centralized booking pages for airlines where you could, shop and price compare. Well, now, like, I am hopeful that very soon I will be able to send an agent to go and like, be my booking agent, like find me the best travel booking from this place to, this other place. And you won't need an intermediary in the middle, like sort of aggregating all of those listings, but rather just like, sort of some entity can like, sort of use the rails of the internet to find it. But one has to build the rails and the sockets for them to actually do so. For example, to trust that your booking agent is not going to overspend your budget, that it's going to like successfully book you a ticket, that it's going to book you a ticket of the type you want, right? Like airline tickets are hard to cancel. Common mistake. You tell the agent, I'm looking for a Russia, like a trip to, a winter trip to St. Petersburg, it might misinterpret and not necessarily know it's got it wrong. So the agentic markets or marketplace interactions have the potential to reduce transaction costs because the agent can shoulder a lot of the transaction costs, just like they do in ad auctions, right? But, you need really carefully designed infrastructure to enable that to work, right? They have this potential to make markets much more efficient by like, creating competition, like, sort of, simplifying information, sort of transmission, simplifying bidding and auctions, all these things. But at the same time, just like with any like sort of new emerging technology, there's like a whole bunch of other challenges that they bring. And these in particular, because they do sort of their own optimizations in natural language, they have a lot of the types of failings we're used to thinking about in sort of principle, sort of like principal agent theory, like in the economics of like, how you ensure that an agent does what you want. It's like a slightly different set of what you want problems, but this is a thing we've studied for a long time. But again, we're sort of rolling back to the earlier versions of this, where you have more control over the situation, more control over the setting, when you can define your own agent and sort of its instructions, at least we hope, and it's a big part of what you guys are helping make happen.
This might be a good place to like end on the part one of this episode. Scott, this was fantastic for giving a tour de force of what market design is. So one last question, like if our listeners want to learn more about market design, what will be the best sources, like canonical sources you will suggest to
great.
go into them?
Okay, there are many good options. Off the top of my head, here are a couple. First of all, Al Roth, who I mentioned earlier, has this great book called Who Gets What and Why, which is a popular press book that talks about many of the different market design exercises he worked on, along with sort of like a general conceptual sort of theory of the field. And it's great. It's like, sort of part like, sort of like history of market design, part, sort of like personal memoir of his work, like, in part like sort of how you think about market failures. There's another really good book, the Inner Lives of Markets by Ray Fisman and Tim Sullivan. Tim Sullivan, my colleague at A16Z Crypto, which is sort of like a tour through a bunch of different types of market designs through history. There's also coming out very soon a book called Minimalist Market Design, which is a monograph by Typhoon Sonmez, who's, been one of the sort of, biggest practitioners and sort of like opening up lots of new market design areas. And this sort of similarly, like it's a combination memoir and like also like philosophy of market design and technical guide. And then for people who are looking at this more as builders, I have a couple of articles that I wrote, in the context of my HBS Making Markets course. There's one called Making Markets. There's also a 3-part framework for entrepreneurial marketplace design, that both are sort of, I think of these as framework guides for people who are thinking about marketplace building on like how to think, sort of, how to think about the problem, how to dissect like the sources of market failure in the market you're working in, and think about how those sources of market failure map to the right marketplace design. And then on the more academic side, there are lots and lots of great survey articles. The Economist is Engineer, Discovering Prices, Paul Milgram's recent book about sort of like, complex price discovery in markets, and also his prior book, Putting Auction Theory to Work, Paul Klemperer's book on auction theory. There's lots and lots of like academic, like technical guides of different levels of resolution. And when we can get people a list. Oh, actually, also one other source for those. If you go to my website, scottkom.com, under courses, there's the syllabus for my market design class, which will get you both those in the general references section and also, lists of lots of related references on specific marketplace topics. QED.
Listeners, if you enjoyed part one of this episode, share it with your friends. You can find Scott at the rate S Kominers on Twitter, and more about his research, as he just said, in scottkom.com. And as always, this is The Coordinate. I'm Soubhik, and this is my co-host Sreeram Kannan. See you in the next part with Scott.